Wyoming Territory, May 1883. The wind howled low across the empty plains as the train pulled away from Rawlins Station, leaving behind a thin woman in a dust-stained dress with a worn satchel clutched to her chest and two small children asleep at her boots. Tally Langford did not cry when the train disappeared. She had done her crying last night. Now, she just stood there in the grit and wind, her mind blank with exhaustion. Her boots hurt, her body ached, and her children, 6-year-old Vera and 4-year-old Vincent, were too tired to walk another step. They had nowhere else to go. A man on horseback lifted his hat as he approached, the sun behind him throwing long shadows across the dirt road. He was lean, broad-shouldered, with a quiet kind of presence that did not come from noise or arrogance but from the steadiness in his eyes. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked, voice low. "This ain't a place to stand too long." Tally looked up at him, shielding her eyes. "We got off by mistake," she said, though it was a lie. "We meant to go farther west." He looked down at the sleeping children, then back at her. "Not much west of here, but wind and rattlers. Where's your husband?" he passed. She said it without blinking. "Last winter." The cowboy nodded once, slow. "You got family?" No one left. He looked at her again, longer this time, reading more than she said. "Name's Foster Bowman. I run a cattle ranch 10 miles north. We're short a cook and someone to watch the bunkhouse laundry." "It ain't glamorous, but it pays." Tally straightened. "You would hire me, just like that? You need a job, I need help, you look like you can work." Foster glanced at the children again. "They'll need a place to sleep. We got a spare room in the ranch house." She hesitated only a moment. "What do I owe you for the ride?" "You owe me nothing," he said, turning his horse. "But if you want the job, climb up." She gathered Vera and Vincent carefully, lifting them into the saddle behind him. He reached down and pulled her up last. His hands were calloused, warm, and steady. Foster's ranch sat between low hills and a winding creek, the grasslands stretching wide and gold beneath the spring sun. The house was modest but clean, with smoke curling from the chimney and the smell of bread in the wind. Tally worked hard from the first morning. She scrubbed laundry until her hands stung, cooked meals for drovers who watched her with tired eyes and soft thanks, and sat every evening with her children on the porch steps, listening to the coyotes howl in the distance. Foster was always nearby but never in the way. He mended fences during the day, rode out with his men, hauled buckets and barrels. But he always came back at dusk, dust on his collar, and nodded to her before heading inside. One evening, after 2 weeks of quiet routine, Foster came to the porch where Tally was mending Vincent's pants. Vera lay curled on a blanket nearby, already asleep. "Kids settling in all right?" he asked, lowering himself to the steps, his hat resting in his hands. "They sleep through the night now," she said. "That's more than they did last month," he nodded. "You're doing good by them." She looked away, blinking fast. "I am trying." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You got someone back east who might come for you, someone looking?" "No," she said softly. "We came from Kansas. A boarding house caught fire. We lost everything. I took what little we had and left. I figured moving west would mean a fresh start." Foster didn't ask more. He just sat beside her, the silence between them not empty but full of something easier than words. By June, the ranch was in full swing with calving season. Tally started helping with the books, too. Once Foster discovered she could read and write better than most of his ranch hands. She worked late some nights, a lantern burning low beside her, Foster sitting across the table with a cup of coffee, watching her scribble numbers with her brow furrowed. "You always been this determined?" he asked one night. She glanced up. "I had to be," he smiled faintly. "Makes sense." The next evening, he brought her a new pair of boots. "For you," he said, setting the box down. "Your old ones are falling apart." She stared at them. "I cannot take these." "You already did," he said, standing again. One Sunday morning, Foster took the children fishing down by the creek. Tally stood at the back porch, watching him hold Vera's hand and carry Vincent on his shoulders. When they returned, the children were laughing, their cheeks sun-warmed and freckled. Foster carried a string of fish, and Vera was telling him a story about a turtle. Tally felt something warm press behind her ribs. Late July brought a dry heat and long days. One night after supper, Foster stepped onto the porch where Tally sat brushing Vera's hair. He stood for a long second, then said, "You have done more than I expected. You carry more than anyone should. You have not once let it break you." Tally looked up at him, unsure how to answer. "I hired you because you needed a place," he went on, voice low, rough. "But I would pay double if you stayed forever." Her breath caught. "I mean that," he said, meeting her eyes. "I have not had much in the way of peace, not until you." She rose slowly, heart pounding. "You really mean it?" He stepped closer. "I do." Tally reached for his hand. "Then I will stay, not for the money, for you." Foster cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing her cheek. "You and them kids, you are home to me now," and when he kissed her, the world fell quiet, not from emptiness, but because everything she needed was finally here. August settled into the valley with a dry stillness, the kind that made the air heavy and the hills seem farther off than they were. The cottonwoods along the creek turned dusty at the edges, and the cattle moved slower through the heat. Foster had started sleeping in the small lean-to beside the barn, leaving the house to Tally and the children. He never spoke of it, just did it one evening after watching Vincent drift off in her lap on the porch. He left his bedroll in the house but never used it again. One afternoon, Tally found him tightening a broken hinge on the chicken coop door, his shirt damp with sweat, sawdust clinging to his sleeves. "That coop's been leaning since we arrived," she said, stepping close with a tin cup of spring water. "I noticed," Foster replied, accepting the cup. "Figured if I didn't fix it soon, those hens would stage a revolt." She smiled, but it faded as she looked at his hands blistered new along the base of his thumb. "You usually patch things yourself." He took a long drink before answering. "I do better with wood and wire than people." "Always have. People aren't so different," she said quietly. "They just take longer to mend." Foster set the cup down. "You reckon you're mended then?" Tally didn't answer right away. "I don't wake up scared anymore. That counts for something." He nodded and returned to the hinge. Later that night, when she tucked the children in, Vincent mumbled, "Mr. Foster smells like the sun." She kissed his forehead without answering, heart too full for words. The next week brought a letter from Carbon County. Foster's brother, who ran cattle near the Sweetwater River, had broken his leg. Foster needed to ride out and take his place for a fortnight. "I'll leave Hank to help you here," he said, cinching his saddle the morning he left. "He's rough around the edges, but he listens." Tally stood beside the corral, Vera holding her hand. "We'll manage." He hesitated before mounting. "If anything seems off, strangers, riders passing too slow, you send Hank to town." "Are you expecting trouble?" "No. But I've learned not to trust peace unless you keep one eye open." 8 days passed without word. Hank kept to himself, chopping wood and bringing in feed sacks, his voice low and eyes kind when he spoke to Vera and Vincent. Tally worked through the days steadily, keeping the house and tending the garden, her fingers stained from beans and soil. On the 9th morning, a rider came down the trail, dust rising behind him. Vera ran to the porch, shouting, "Mama, it's Mr. Foster." Tally stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron as he dismounted. He looked leaner, sunburned, a new crease beside his mouth. "Your brother?" she asked. "Out of bed and swearing," Foster said, "which means he's healing." He took off his hat and looked at her. "I miss this place." She nodded, unsure what to say. Vera tugged on his pants leg and he bent to lift her with a quiet grunt. She wrapped her arms around his neck. Vincent came out then, squinting into the light. "Did you bring anything?" Foster reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a carved wooden horse. "Made it while waiting on a fence crew. He's called Dusty." Vincent took it solemnly, then ran off to show Hank. That evening, Foster lingered after supper as she dried the plates. The children had fallen asleep on the rug, curled together like kittens. "I thought about you," he said, voice low behind her. Tally turned slowly. "I thought about you too." He took a step closer. "I don't want to sleep in that lean-to anymore." Her breath caught. "Then don't." He reached for her hand and she let him, their fingers fitting together like they'd been waiting all summer. "I want more than just sharing a roof," he said. "I want a life with you, not borrowed, not halfway." She looked down at their hands. "I'm not scared of work, Foster. But I'm scared of it going wrong again." "It won't," he said gently. "You're not alone in this." He kissed her there in the kitchen, the oil lamp flickering above them, the scent of soap and stew still in the air. It wasn't rushed or uncertain. It was the kind of kiss that spoke of seasons to come, of winters endured together, of harvests and hearth fires, of knowing someone's breath even in the dark. When they pulled apart, Foster said, "Tomorrow, we'll talk to the preacher in town." "I figure we've both waited long enough." Tally nodded, eyes bright. "Yes, let's not wait anymore." The church sat on a rise just east of the valley, weathered white boards and a tin roof that rattled in the wind. Foster tied the horse to the hitching post while Tally lifted Vincent from the saddle. Vera had braided a ribbon into her hair that morning, and Tally had let her, though it didn't match anything she wore. Inside, the preacher, a stoop-shouldered man named Herrick, spoke soft and slow, as though the dust outside might blow through the walls and carry the words away if he didn't weigh them down. He didn't ask for details. Didn't need to. He looked at Foster, then at Tally, then back again and nodded once before opening his Bible. Afterward, they stepped out into the sunlight as man and wife. Vera took Foster's hand without hesitation. Vincent clung to Tally's skirt, blinking up at the light. No bells rang. No one stood waiting. But it didn't feel small. Back home, Foster unsaddled the horse himself, ran a hand along its flank, then turned to look at the house. "I'll build you a porch roof," he said. "You ought to have shade come summer." Tally stood on the steps, her fingers brushing the edge of the doorframe. "You don't have to. I want to." He crossed the yard, stopping just short of the stoop. "And I'll plant something out front. Wind's bad, but if we set a low fence, we might get hollyhocks to take." "I haven't seen hollyhocks since Kansas," she said. "My mother used to press them between the pages of our family Bible. I figured you might like that." That night, after the children had gone quiet, they sat by the hearth in silence broken only by the pop of settling logs. Foster leaned forward, turning a small piece of wood in his hands. He'd been carving something new, though he hadn't said what. Tally rested her chin on her hand. "You don't talk much about before." "No used to, it's gone." "Still," she said, "I'd like to know." He turned the carving once more, then set it aside. "My father was a mule breeder, hard man. Said a boy had to learn early not to ask for comfort. I left at 15 to work trail herds. Never went back." "Is he still alive?" "Doubt it. If he is, he's out there somewhere not wondering about me." Tally didn't answer. She reached across the space between them and took his hand. He looked at her fingers laced through his. "I never figured on building anything lasting, but I want to now, with you." She nodded once, firm. "Then we will." The next morning, Foster rose early and began measuring the porch with a length of twine. He didn't ask for help, but Vera brought him a cup of water, and Vincent sat nearby with Dusty clutched in his lap, watching every movement with solemn eyes. By midweek, the posts were in. Tally hung linens to dry and watched the frame taking shape. It wasn't fancy, just 4 beams and a promise, but it changed the way the house stood on the land. Less temporary, more rooted. One evening, as dusk colored the hills, Foster came in with a splinter lodged deep in his palm. Tally guided him to the basin, took a needle from the tin by the stove, and wordlessly began working it loose. "You're good at this," he murmured. "I had to be," she said. "When Vera was born, there wasn't a doctor in town. Just me and a woman with a bad hip and a sharp tongue. You did it alone." "I did it afraid, but I did it." He watched her work, the tight set of her jaw, the steadiness of her hands. "You don't like to talk about the hard parts." "I lived them once," she said. "No need to live them twice." When the splinter came free, she pressed a strip of cloth around his hand and tied it snug. "You should rest that hand." "I'll rest when the roof's finished." The next morning, she found a single hollyhock seedling tucked behind the water barrel, its leaves trembling in the wind. Not planted yet, just waiting. She crouched beside it, the dirt damp from where he must have tested the soil. She didn't touch it, just watched it for a while, then stood and went back inside. That night, as a storm rolled low and far to the west, they lay curled together, the air thick with summer and something else quieter, deeper. Foster murmured against her hair, "You still believe this is a fresh start?" "I do," she whispered, "but not because we ran from something." "Why then?" "Because we're building toward something." Outside, the wind picked up, but the house held firm. And in the dark, their hands found each other and stayed there, steady as the beams he'd set with his own 2 hands. By early September, the wind shifted. Mornings came cooler, the air edged with the first bite of autumn. The cattle grew restless near the fence line, noses high, sensing what was coming. Foster rose before light most days, checking the herds along the north pasture where the grass thinned out first. Tally watched from the kitchen window, her breath fogging the glass, her apron still damp from washing up. One morning, as she stacked kindling behind the stove, she heard Foster's boots on the porch. He stepped inside, brushing dust from his sleeves, eyes narrowed in thought. "There's a man asking around in Rawlins," he said, setting his hat on the peg. "Came in on the eastbound freight. Asked about a woman with 2 children, said she left Kansas by rail." Tally didn't move. Her hand stayed on the stove door, skin prickling beneath her sleeves. "He give a name?" she asked. "No, just said he was kin, nobody could place him." She straightened slowly. "There's no one left to come for me." Foster studied her a long moment. "You want me to ride in, see him for myself?" "No," she said. "If he's looking for me, he's not coming for anything good." He nodded once. "Then we'll keep to our own." In the weeks that followed, Foster doubled the fence line around the west edge of the property where the creek ran closest to the trail. He posted Hank there through dusk and kept the rifle cleaned and near the door. Tally didn't ask questions. She kept the children close, taught them to stay inside past dark, and made sure her boots were by the door each night. One evening, as the sun dropped low and turned the grass copper, Vera pulled at Tally's sleeve. "Is Mama's name still Mama?" she asked. Tally paused, folding a towel near the stove. "It is." "Did you have a different name before?" "I did." Vera frowned, thinking hard. "Can I know it?" "Someday," Tally said. "But not today." She caught Foster's eyes across the room, and he gave the faintest shake of his head. Vera didn't ask again. The next morning, Foster rode out and returned after dusk with a worn book tucked beneath his coat. He handed it to Tally without a word. Inside were blank pages bound in leather, the kind used for keeping records or recipes. She ran her fingers along the spine. "What's it for?" she asked. "Whatever you need it to be." She set it on the table beside the oil lamp. "I haven't written anything real since before the fire." "You've lived it," he said. "That counts." That night, after the children had gone down, she opened to the first page. The ink stuttered in her hand at first, but the words came slow and careful. Not names, not places. Just the feel of heat on her back and the sound of train whistles and the color of Vera's hair in sunlight. Foster sat nearby, sharpening a blade in slow strokes, the scrape of steel marking time. "I used to think I'd forget it all if I didn't write it down," she said, her voice low. "Now I think I just needed to stop carrying it everywhere." He set the blade aside. "You can leave it here. I'll keep it safe." She looked up at him, the firelight flickering across his face. "You already do." The days grew shorter and the house took on a different rhythm. Vincent learned to feed the chickens without spilling grain, and Vera started sorting beans with a precision that made Tally smile behind her hand. Foster added a second latch to the front door, just in case, though he never said what for. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Sweetwater. Foster handed it to Tally and she opened it by the stove, careful not to tear the fold. It was from the brother, just a few lines, written in a tight hand. The leg was healing straight. The cattle were holding weight. And he asked straight out if Foster was planning on keeping the woman and her children, or if they'd be moving on come winter. Tally read the words twice, then passed the letter back. "What should I say?" Foster asked. "Nothing," she said, voice even. "Unless you're unsure." "I'm not." She returned to peeling apples, the rhythm of the knife clean and steady. As the first frost came, Foster tacked thick canvas around the chicken coop and moved the firewood closer to the porch. He worked late into the evening, his breath white in the cold, his hands moving like he already knew what came next. Inside, Tally stitched a quilt from scraps left behind in the bunkhouse. She didn't measure the pieces, just let them fit where they wanted, trusting the shape would hold. At night, when the wind picked up and the rafters creaked, she lay beside him with her feet tucked beneath his legs, warm beneath the blankets he'd hauled down from the attic. He'd rest a hand at her hip, quiet and firm like he meant to keep her anchored, and she believed him. Not because he promised, because he already had. A thin layer of snow clung to the fields by the 1st of November, not enough to stay, but enough to leave the earth quiet and pale. Cattle moved slower in the chill, their breath rising like ghosts in the air. The porch roof Foster had built held firm under the weight of frost, and the hollyhocks, though long withered, still left their dry stalks standing like sentinels by the fence. Tally stitched a lining into Vincent's coat one morning while Vera practiced letters with a slate at the kitchen table. Foster came in from checking the trap lines, his coat damp, and the scent of pine clinging to him. "There's a man camped down by the cattle trail," he said, setting his rifle in the corner. "Not close, but too near for comfort." Tally didn't lift her head. "What does he want?" Claims he's trading pelts, but he was asking after a woman and 2 kids again. Said he'd been riding west since August. She stood then, slow and deliberate. "He has a name," didn't offer one, didn't ask mine. "I don't want to run again," she said. "You won't." That night, Foster cleaned the rifle by lantern light, his movements calm but precise. Tally watched him from the doorway, arms folded to hold in the chill. "Did you know," she said, "I used to play organ in a church back home." He looked up. "I didn't. Only for 1 season. The preacher's daughter caught a fever and I filled in. I wasn't much good, but I liked the quiet before the service started, that stillness. You miss it. I think I miss the feeling of being useful. You're that here." She gave a small nod. "I know. But it's different when you're needed." He leaned back in the chair, wiping the barrel clean. "I need you, not for the cooking or the books, just you." She crossed the room and knelt beside him, resting her head against his knee. "Then I'll stay. No matter who comes." The man by the trail left 2 days later. Hank followed his tracks west past the ridge, then returned with word that he'd sold his pelts in Rawlins and moved on. Foster didn't speak of it again, but he added a second dog to the yard, a big black and white stray that had wandered in from the south fence and taken to Vincent like kin. By early December, the snow came steady. Foster cut a sled path to town and brought back flour, lamp oil, and a small wrapped parcel he wouldn't let Tally see. He stored it in the root cellar where the children wouldn't find it. On Christmas morning, Vera woke first, whispering excitedly to Vincent, who tumbled from bed still half asleep. Tally watched them from the doorway, her shawl wrapped tight, the fire already low and glowing. Foster handed her the worn parcel, his fingers brushing hers. Inside was a folded square of linen, stitched with her initials TL along one edge in careful thread. "It's not much," he said. "But I thought you ought to have something with your name on it." She pressed it to her chest. "I haven't seen those letters in years. They're still yours." He handed Vincent a carved boat, its hull smooth and dark. Vera received a small wooden box with a clasp she opened and closed again and again, marveling at the sound. That evening, after the children were asleep and the wind had died to a whisper, Tally reached into the shelf by the hearth and pulled out the leather-bound book. She opened to the first page she'd left blank. "I want to write it all down," she said. "Not just what came before, what's here now." Foster leaned in close, the firelight catching the lines at the corners of his mouth. "Then start with today." She dipped the pen. "It snowed." Vera laughed in her sleep. "Vincent named the dog Patch, and you warmed my hands without me asking." He kissed her then, slow and sure, the kind that asked nothing and gave everything. By spring, the fences had held strong through the snowmelt. The creek rose high but never overran. The hollyhocks came back in soft green shoots, shy and stubborn. Tally planted beans and onions in the garden, Vera helping with a wooden trowel, Vincent chasing Patch through the tall grass. Foster began building a second room onto the house not because they needed space, but because they could. He let Vera choose the color for the shutters. She picked sky blue. One evening in April, Tally sat on the porch steps, her hands resting on the curve of her belly. Foster stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, thumb moving slow across her collarbone. "You scared?" he asked. She looked out across the field where the last of the sun turned the grass gold. "Not anymore." He sat beside her, their knees touching. "You think it'll be a boy? I think it'll be ours." The children came out then, barefoot and breathless, and Patch barked once before settling into the dirt. The wind stirred the cottonwoods and carried with it no sound but the creak of the porch and the quiet breath of a family that had found its way forward. Foster reached for her hand, and Tally laced her fingers through his without hesitation. They had nothing left to run from, only days ahead. And they would meet, every one of them together.